Good morning. I'm Sudi Chamanara, Chairperson of Ethnic Social Services Referral. I'm pleased to welcome you all here. Before I start, few household things. The bathroom from the door after the big door in your left hand. Please turn off your phone. Really appreciate that. Our organization established 1997, hoping to help community, especially Iranian. We have a flyer and give it to you. I hope it's explain everything. I don't want to take your time for that. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker today. I really appreciate your effort. I would like to thank you, Ms. Gelare Basiri, our very, very active member who organized today's event, and Mrs. Mehnoush Abshari and Ali Sarshar Mehnoush did all the administrative, and Mr. Sarshar did all donation. And thank you for your effort as well. I leave it to Gelare to explain other people to help us, but I would like to thank you, Mr. Taqi Mukhtar, for helping us from the beginning of the organization established in his newspaper, Iranian. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here in this beautiful Sunday today. Sudi Chamanara, who just spoke with you, is the founder of Ethnic Social Referral Services, and she founded this organization in 1997. And then we have joined her, Ms. Elahe Salur, and Mehnoush Abshari and I eventually joined her in hope of helping the Iranian community to be a more successful community. And as our community changed, our activities has changed as well. And we are glad we have been able to help with other organizations in the community to help our own community. I'm truly excited today because we are doing this conference in collaboration with our second generation, with our younger generation, Iranian alliances across borders. And I have become familiar with them through the involvement of my children in there, and then all the wonderful things that they do in the community. I would also like to mention a few changes that we had to make in the agenda. I'm sorry that it's a last-minute change, and I hope you don't mind, because I realize for some of you it's been difficult to get here because of the directions. I apologize for that as well. We are not going to go to the break after our second speaker. And we are going to go on with our third speaker, and then we would break for lunch afterward. Before I introduce our first speaker, I would also like to mention all the community groups that have been helping us, thanks to Children of Persia for giving us a table in their walk last week. Thanks to Iranian of Washington, thanks to Neighbors Restaurant for tremendously helping us with lunch today, and I hope you would all enjoy that. And with a great pleasure, I would like to introduce, yes, and also our dear friend, Mr. Cyrus Anvari, who brought us the breakfast, and I hope you all enjoyed it. And sorry, we had a little problem with warming up the water. So, without any delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker to you that I'm very proud to have here with us. She came last night from New York. She's the executive of IAB, Iranian Alliances Across Border. Her name is Mana Kharazi. She received her bachelor degree in International Studies and Middle Eastern Studies, along with her minor in Persian from Emory University. While at Emory, Mana Jan co-organized a lot of lecture series and brought together the Persians in the community in Georgia, where she was, and at school where she was studying. Mana started with Iranian Alliances Across Border in 2007, and she has been a devoted volunteer for many years until IAB has been able to get a generous donation from Parsa Foundation, and then she could be an employee of IAB after so many years of volunteering. So I'm glad to have Mana with us here. She is the executive director, and she continues the role of a community organizer, and she was responsible for Amnesty International organizing campaigns before joining IAB, and she did a lot of wonderful things. She has led numerous training and workshops, participated in panels in different universities throughout the South, and organized events with the ACLU and NAACP and other nonprofit organizations. She also worked at the Carter Center and all the other wonderful things that I know about, and I don't have them written down. Mana Kharazi is our first speaker. Welcome.
Thank you for that very warm introduction. I'm really excited to be here today, and I'm going to be talking about some of the issues that our community faces, particularly our youth. I do want to recognize the fact that all of you are here on a Sunday morning. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir. You already are engaged in community work. You already care a great deal. And I think the people that we need to have as a part of this conversation, unfortunately, aren't in this room. So hopefully, in our discussions today, we can act as advocates and continue these conversations throughout the community spaces we are a part of, whether they're Farsi schools or centers, other cities, hopefully. So hopefully we can continue the conversation there as well. So I am trying to share a little bit about myself. Kayvon said I should not take this too seriously and try to be engaging, especially on a Sunday morning. So I want to just say really quickly what's really interesting about my personal background. This is a picture of my mother's family, and my mom is probably right here where you can't see very well. She and my father were both born during World War II. And the reason I'm sharing this is that there's a lot of intergenerational experiences just in my family. I am one of three, and I'm the only one born in the 80s. I'm the only one that grew up outside of Iran. So I have the pleasure of watching my siblings now go through all of their experiences. My sister, who just turned 50 this year, had her first child go to college. My brother, who just turned 40 this year, is trying to figure out how to raise a child who is half Iranian and living in the great city of New York. So it's interesting how much that's added to my experience, both in understanding why it's important that we speak across generations, and also what the challenges may be, which our family is indicative of that as well. I work for this organization we mentioned, Iranian Alliances Across Borders. IAB is an organization that was started by students, college students who were living here, and it was in response to going to London and seeing what a wonderful experience Iranians had in England. There are so many programs about 10 years ago, conversations, conferences, and in the States 10 years ago there was just one national organization that had started a few months before that was very much focused on politics. There were no Iranian conferences for us. There were no spaces where we could talk about mental health professional issues, or all of the other issues our community has on a national level. Obviously ESSR, and there's a lot of great local work happening all across the country, but when it came to what we talked about as a community, that was very much lacking. So what should we have been talking about as a community 10 years ago? There's actually, and this is something I should clarify, whatever I say, there's no accurate statistical information about. We as a community still are not documented. We barely are involved in the census. The last one, 2010, we're not recognized as a group in that. So when it comes to any survey that's been about our community, it's either been at most maybe 1,000 people that have been surveyed. Usually it's around 100. So anything you've heard, whether it's from national organizations or local work, there's not a lot of information about us. We don't even have an accurate count of how many of us there are in the States. That's actually made it difficult. The information I'm going to be sharing is about what EOP has kind of discovered, and that's because we do a lot of programs. We have international conferences, we have camps, we have students come from all across the country. Our camps currently have about 130 participants that are campers, high schoolers and middle schoolers. We have about 200, including our staff and all of our volunteers. We've had over 1,000 students involved. So we have a good picture of what likely is going on in our community. And unfortunately, some of the challenges we face are probably the same ones that we talked about in the 80s, which is we're still very much religiously and politically divided. We are a very diverse community, ethnically, linguistically, religiously, politically, but we're still very much divided along those lines. Socioeconomically, something we don't talk about. We do have a lot of members in our community who don't fit that model minority picture that we draw of how successful we are. We do have C-level executives, right? We have a lot of really strong individual leaders. But as a community, we also have an entire segment that's completely ignored. We have new waves of immigrants coming in, refugees, asylum seekers. We have folks who are still struggling, even if they've been here a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades financially. We have generational divisions. We are a very good group here from many different generations. That's not really indicative of our community in general. We still have a lot of our elderly members who don't have spaces, so there aren't very few elderly centers. I don't want to just focus on the youth. There are very few elderly centers, very few centers for people who came out before the revolution, are here, and don't have spaces to speak in their language or connect with people. They're isolated at homes. We also don't have a lot of community centers for our youth. So we have our camp, we have Farsi schools, but there's a lot that we're still missing. And of course, any kind of space that connects them. DC, Maryland, Virginia has some good spaces, but when I grew up in Atlanta, I didn't have that. A lot of folks in the Midwest don't have that. And even in Southern California, where they do have the opportunity, there are so many, they're still very much divided. So those are some of the issues we're facing. And one I do want to talk about also is some of the cultural challenges we face too. We don't even need to do the raise of hand, but many of us have heard when it comes to business, don't work with other Iranians, right? Many of us have heard, I've heard from community leaders, and this is one of the most disappointing things I've heard is like, nothing's gonna move forward in our community until our older generation disappears. Not true, and it's unfortunate because a lot of our older generation tend to be the folks who help with culture. Those who have their grandparents involved in their lives tend to speak Farsi better, tend to have a better sense of identity, tend to have a better sense of community, family, belonging. So that's something that's really unfortunate that anyone would think of. The funny thing is a lot of times I hear it from people who are of that generation. DC, I want to give a big shout out for the DMV area because I wish I'd grown up here. And as you can see by some of our wonderful volunteers like Roshan, Pani, Rosa, Kayvon, Arya, Hayam, I could Shadi, there are so many of you in the audience. Growing up in this space, there's a large population of Iranians. If you were to include DC, Maryland, Virginia, that would be the second largest in this country after Southern California, LA, which is the largest outside of Iran in the world. So a large population that actually gets along. That beats out Southern California. So there's community support. You have 2 AA groups here in Persian, entirely run in Persian, which our ambassador is a part of and has organized, which is amazing. to even acknowledge that you have an issue, and then to be able to get support from your peers in your language. That's something we could talk about entirely in its own about Aberoo. We have walkathons. Just last week there was Children Persian walkathons. Social Services, the organization that organized this. There's cultural centers. Some of the best language programs in this country are here. You have a wonderful school in Maryland. You have wonderful schools in Virginia. You also have programs, events, so many different conferences and events here. And then there's a very particular youth experience that's unique to here. Growing up, and I moved around a lot, but growing up in Atlanta, I always thought that everyone else who went to school here felt a little bit ashamed about being Iranian because it was such a marginalized and demonized community. What was really interesting for me was when I first met my campers from the Maryland and Virginia area, they told me that to be Iranian here meant to be exotic, and that was the word they used. So there's a benefit to being part of a large, organized, active population. It also means your school experience is very different. Another thing that's unique about this community is that there's a national NGO presence. Every national Iranian organization either is based here or has its roots from here. Those Iranian students I talked about who started EOB, one of them is Virginia's very own Nargis. She grew up here, went to all of the different programs, and her family is a very strong part of this community. So I actually want to focus on a very different community for a second. I'm giving you kind of a broad view of what our community challenges are and also recognizing our strengths. A lot of times we either focus completely on the problems or completely on our successes and don't want to talk about the other. I think that it's important that we recognize them. Toronto is the #1 destination right now for Iranians leaving Iran. It's the fastest growing community. It also has very unique youth challenges. There's issues of gangs, because there are a lot of Iranians who move there as teenagers who aren't really having as easy a time to assimilate and become a part of that community. It also has the largest international festival of Iranians in the world. Over 120,000 people come to Tirgan every 2 years, which was just this past summer, which I got to be a part of. They have social service and cultural organizations as well. They also have something that we're sorely missing in this country, which is philanthropy. They have a lot of donors, so all their C-level folks actually donate back into the community, something that doesn't happen here often. There's foundations, so if you want to do any kind of programming there, you can get money. They have elderly and youth centers. There's a man who's a CEO of a company there, and because of the issues of his own parents not having any kind of space, he created a foundation, and there's a bus that comes and picks up all of the elderly of that community. Gives them a space to be social and not feel so isolated. Depression's a big issue within that age group in particular. And then there's also something that's very unique about Toronto, and I do have to recognize that, is that there's a lot of government, social, and cultural support. It's within a country that funds its groups. So Vancouver has an Iranian National Ballet. I didn't know. Toronto has all sorts of organizations. There's a lot more within the arts there than there is here. And this organization that runs Tirgan, I thought EOB was remarkable in that we were all volunteer run, and we had 20 staff, and that was incredible, and we did these programs with hundreds. They do programs with 100,000 people, and it's all completely volunteer run. And most of the volunteers they have been in the country for less than 5 years. So it's a clear need that they have as part of that community that they're filling. I do a lot of work within our community, and I have this wonderful experience of being part of these youth programs, and so I feel comfortable talking about that as an expert. We do run a camp, which I'll show you a little bit more about, and we've been working with campers since 2006, so 8 years worth of camps, over 1,000. Many of the people I mentioned in the beginning have gone through the camp either as campers or counselors, or campers, counselors, and staff in some cases. We have a high retention rate, but what we've noticed with our campers and with the youth we work with particularly, is that some of the challenges that they're facing are particularly around social experiences. So if you, and this is a generational divide just even amongst us, I remember what it's like to live in this country and go to school before 9/11. I remember what it's like to live here before Fox News existed, before all the terminology that's been used about being Iranian. I wasn't part of the 80s, right? the experiences of folks in the 80s and the experiences of the youth now are more similar than they are to me. Particularly post 9/11, this generation, they're dealing with being part of a demonized community. They're constantly being asked to be a representative of their community. This isn't true for all of them. It depends on where they are, how saturated their community is with Iranians, how active they are, how organized they are. But in general, we do have issues of self-confidence, there's social struggles, expectations of parents, which that's a big part of Aberoo. We'll talk about that, and discrimination in general that they're experiencing. Community experiences, when they do have access to the Iranian community locally, it's usually divided. I am one of many people who remembers what it's like to go to Seiz Dabadat or some sort of event and see some big argument break up the entire gathering over politics, people from different parts who represented different views of the revolution, who question each other, there's paranoia, suspicion, all of those things. And it's real and it's also understandable because of the trauma of the revolution. Completely understandable. At the same time, it does mean that a lot of youth don't have community spaces that they feel comfortable in. And when they are a part of that space, the socioeconomic issues come up, the materialism, things like that also can be very divisive in those spaces, even just amongst their own age group. I remember I used to, before I got to know Iyab, I used to constantly say, I love being Iranian, I just don't like other Iranians. That's something that I've heard from a lot of our youth, and it's unfortunate. And also identity. There's a lack of a sense of belonging. You know, like my mom would talk about like, ihsas ghurbat. I was like, I get you, I feel it all the time. I go with Iranians, and now I'm older and I feel more solid in my identity. But when I was younger, I remember telling people, whenever I was with Iranians, they'd always say, well, you as an American, like, what are your views? You tell us about it. And then every time I go with my American friends, it's like, well, you as an Iranian. And I didn't really belong anywhere. And I didn't really feel like I fit in anywhere. And when it came to social aspects of my identity as a teenager, what I was allowed and not allowed to do, I definitely felt like I was just in this third group of people, and in the South particularly separate from everyone. Self-love, community, language is something I'm going to talk about because language shaming is a rampant issue, particularly in the youth. And then misconceptions of what it means to be Iranian-American. We constantly, not all of us, but we constantly keep pushing this view of to be Iranian-American means you are a doctor or, okay, a lawyer too. To be Iranian-American means you have to have at least 3 to 4 degrees, and all these other things. And if you don't fit in that, then you're a bad Iranian, because that's what is implied to young Iranian-Americans. So either be a part of it and completely engage, or disengage and accept that you're not a part of it and hate that community. I've had one experience I had in particular that still stands out is I had a parent talk to me about how she was crying after her daughter went to camp and said, you know, we are very proud parents. We did everything. We went to all the events. We tried to introduce our daughter to all of her cousins. We tried to get her to be a part of her community. We did everything. It's not like we completely ignored it. But our daughter still was recognized at school for writing a poem about how much she hated being Iranian-American. And the kind of rhetoric she used, you could have taken straight from Fox News at the time. And she said, you know, we would try to get her to see her cousins. She didn't want to see them. She would talk openly about how she didn't like her community, she didn't like her culture, and how backwards it is and all these things. And she came to camp, and for the first time, she met, and it was a struggle to get to her to camp, she met people of her age group that she connected with who liked similar music, had similar interests, and at the same time were Iranian. And it completely changed all of her misconceptions about what that meant. And for the first time after that camp, she wanted to go visit her family. She wanted to then start taking classes in the language and learning more about her culture. We hear that story all the time. And it's, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois talks about like the self-hating African American. It's an issue that is also very relevant in our community. So Camp Oyanda and Camp Javon, I kind of talked about a little bit. These are our camps. Oyanda is for high schoolers, and then Javon, which is actually Camp Oyanda Javon, the little future, the young future, is our middle school camp. They are these 10 days overnight programs that, thank you. There are these 10-day overnight programs, and we actually have had over 1,000 campers go through these programs. I'm going to actually just go ahead and let you take a look at it instead of me trying to explain it.
همچنین که بیشتر باشون آشنا میشی صمیمیتت خیلی بیشتر میشه. اولین جایی که رفتم مردم به جای اینکه از من دور بشن به نزدیک شدن و خیلی باهام خوب بودن. مدرسه که بودم اونجوری بود که میگم مردم دور میشن بعد از اینکه فهمیدن چجور آدمی هستی میاد میشه. داخل خونه با دوستام دیگه مثلا اونجوری نیست که قبلا بود. بچه‌ها میبینن کی قشنگتر مثلا بیشتر میخندونته میرن طرف اون. ولی اینجا کسی که به شخصیت اهمیتی نمیده، فقط باهاتن، با دوست میمونن، یعنی که ولت نمیکنن، در مورد مثلا حرف نمیزنن، پشت سرت حرف نمیزنن، داخل موقعیت ها تنهات نمیذارن. الان میبینم اینقدر زیباست، چیزایی که یاد گرفتم اینقدر زیباست، سعی میکنم به حتی مادرم شده، به خواهرم، دوستام، به هر کی که میشناسم تعریف کنم. کم یه اکسپریانس خاصه که وقتی واردش میشی دوست نداری ازش خارج بشی. هر دقیقه که به آخر کمپ نزدیک میشی بغض من بیشتر میشه، یعنی که ناراحتی من همینجوری داره بیشتر و بیشتر میشه و هیچ وقت دوست ندارم از اینجا برم. ثانیه شماری میکنم تا سال دیگه که بتونم دوباره به کمپ بیام.
What I also like about that video is Nima, who's the current camper, he actually lived in Iran, grew up in Iran, moved to Turkey, and then came to the States. Our campers reflect the diversity of our community in all the different waves. So there are some who are half Iranian, have never been to Iran, don't speak a word of Farsi, and there are others who could speak Farsi 20 times better than me. It completely, and also from all across the country, and even internationally. We've had campers from France, from Germany, from Canada, and other countries as well. So it's given us a really good view of what our community needs and also some of the challenges we have. What we do at camp, we build a very inclusive space that celebrates all diversity. The girl in the corner, Ghazal, is actually our first non-Iranian camper. She's Afghan-American, and she just came this past camp. We actually have made it an open space for everyone. So folks who are Persian-speaking or come from Persian-speaking communities are also now becoming a part of it. We talk about all of the community challenges. So it's a space where we talk about the socioeconomic issues. It's a space where we talk about some of our mental health needs, all of issues around sexuality, things like that. Things that are kind of taboo in our community. We talk in a way that's appropriate to talk about it with a group of minors. We also do team and trust building activities, a lot of leadership activities. We have art, theater, music, so we do talk about leadership in various sectors. We also do leadership activities that are more kinesthetic, more hands-on. And what's, I think, particularly unique about our camp is that we have a network of mentors and role models like myself and folks a little bit older and younger than me who have gone through the experience of growing up here or growing up in other parts of the world, and what it means to kind of build your own identity and reconcile your experiences with this culture. So it's particularly helpful in that way. I didn't know what I was doing when I was doing the college application process. Had I gone to camp, I would have had 100 folks who could have helped me with that, who I would have then been able to visit at these campuses. And we also want to recognize that we do have strengths in other fields. So there's so much pressure, be a doctor, be a lawyer. Not that we say don't be, but we say that you can do anything you want. And here are some folks who have done really amazing work in other fields as well. The conversations we have ended up putting together statements. So our Student Summit, which is our university program, there was a picture that came out, a poster, Let's Play Cowboys and Iranians a few years ago that was in a restaurant. It was in Texas, and it was this picture of this Iranian man surrounded by cowboys, and he had this noose around his neck, and it made the national news after 30 years. What was interesting about the conversations our students had, many organizations put out statements. Our students put out a statement as a part of the Action Network, and what they did that was really unique is they recognized the violence of that, right? They recognized how it was demonizing and attacking our community. They also recognize the history of lynching and what that's meant to the African-American community. They recognize the Let's Play Cowboys and Iranians and what that's meant with indigenous communities here, and the idea of the cowboys and Indians. So it was very good in terms of solidarity with other communities. And that's something I think that's particularly incredible about our younger generation. The fact that they recognize that. Also teamwork. We got a group of maybe 10 or 12 students who volunteered and spent their Saturday night together. I've seen a lot of times where in our community that's ended up in conflict and nothing came out of it. They did a great job of creating the statement and then getting buy-in, completely facilitated by themselves. And also, so another program we do is Our Story, addressing the Middle East in the classroom. That quote, my daughter had to read Not Without My Daughter in middle school. She came home crying because her classmates ridiculed her for being Iranian. That's a real experience that a lot of our students have in schools. That one of my students talked about having a book report and on Not Without My Daughter, and all of the pictures along the room were pictures of like, they could address that. They're often asked to be representatives about these issues. So I've talked about what we do in our space for these issues. I want to talk a little bit about what we can do in the family. So one thing that's come out of our camp is we have conversations about, well, why is your family here? What brought them here? We talk about the different waves of immigration. And a lot of times our students then say, I have no idea what my family story is. And they go back to their families and they ask. This is something that is really helpful. A lot of times it's pain, embarrassment, shame, discomfort, hoping that if we can just kind of forget that part of our history, then we can move on. Your children want to know, and it's a big part of their story as well. And it's very moving for them. It's also something that is very intergenerational. That's a great dialogue to have. That's something that can definitely connect our children with our parents and our grandparents. Language and culture. Now, we talk about at EOB how Farsi schools are the entry point a lot of times for culture and language. The truth is it comes from the family first, and that's the number one opportunity for us. I just this past week had a conversation with my mom where she was like, us Iranians like do this, you all do this. That's something that is a disconnect. I got very sensitive, especially with the work I do, and I was like, Mom, I'm Iranian too. That's something that I in my 20s can have that conversation, but a lot of times that kind of conversation, the language you have to be very careful around in your family. Also, a lot of times at camp we specifically don't do any language instruction. We do translate words, but the reason being a lot of us, particularly younger generation, have experience. If you don't know Farsi, you're not Iranian, and how much you know depends on how Iranian you are. There's a lot of language shaming around that. So feeling uncomfortable with using, even if you do know the language, around other Iranians because you're going to be embarrassed when they say your accent's so sweet, and things that are sweet, but what ends up happening is that the younger person feels like they should be embarrassed or not really practice that. Culture is also, so all of these are things that are important in the family. Sexual expression I put up there. It is not something we do at camp. We do not talk about this, and it's particularly important because it's based on your family belief systems, your values, what kinds of experiences your parents do want to talk about or don't want to talk about. All communities struggle with this intergenerational dialogue about sexuality and sexual expression. All communities. This is a conversation, though, that does have to happen in the family. When you don't have this conversation with your children about sexuality and sexual expression, what does happen is your children will talk to their peers, they'll go and talk in schools, they learn things from the media, which we all know is not a good idea, from television, from films, and so there's a lack of knowledge around that, which means there's also a lack of safety. When you send your children to college and they do not know how to deal with their bodies, they do not know how to deal with boundaries with other people, there are oftentimes issues around date rape and all sorts of violence on the campus that they have to deal with. It comes in high school, so it's not something you can put off until right after graduation either. This is a conversation that should happen, and it's really tough. All of these conversations are difficult, but they need to happen in the family. Substance abuse, a lot of these things come up. And parents think if we don't talk about it, it won't happen, we'll ignore it. And it doesn't. It happens, and the problem is it happens with your kids knowing nothing about it and having no sort of sense of boundaries or safety. Mental health is also very important. these kids, and I'm surprised because I thought my parents who are in their 70s were kind of all about academic pressure, but the parents who grew up here, went to college here, wouldn't be. These kids all feel academic pressure for the most part. They all struggle with it. And what that leads to is issues of self-harm. I have many students that we hear instances of self-harm, self-confidence issues, struggles, mental health, anxiety disorders, things that our mental health professionals can talk about in much better issues and much more decisively. But it is something that comes up in our community, and it's something that the family can really deal with. Ignoring it's not going to make it any better. So the tough conversations at the end of the day are really something that we're hoping that the families can be a part of, and central. They are central to those conversations. I mentioned Farsi schools. So we have several programs that we do. One of them is our Persian language Educator Symposium. I go and I give similar talks to Farsi schools, community centers, all sorts of spaces. And what I tell them, these are our best practices. Create a community space that engages parents and families. That's another space addressing the generational gap. ICEC, some of the other Farsi schools here do a great job of that. The more successful Farsi schools, the more successful community centers don't just focus on one generation. The Qanun in Atlanta only focused on my mother's generation, and now they have nobody in my generation that wants to be a leader. It's actually closed its doors this year. That's a common issue. Also, if you're working with youth in particular, using other forms of communication, so social media, go where they go. If you have a kid and you don't know what Tumblr is, you should really look into that, because that's actually been a space that's really impacted them when it comes to all those social issues around sexual expression, things like that. Have an idea of what they're using, what they're looking at. If you're organizing in the community, use them as spaces to communicate with them. If you're parents, be involved, because your children are having these conversations in these spaces, and can very much Facebook. There's a whole push in the schools and with parents around Facebook and bullying and online bullying. These are things that are very difficult in our community as well. Building informal social spaces for youth. So if you're going to have like a Farsi class, or you're going to have a community space, whatever space you're a part of, also having some sort of space for them informally so they get to know their peers and build relationships. If they're connected to each other socially, they're going to show up to all of the events and be a part of it, and your alumni will then continue so that they don't have the challenge of the Qanun that's closing, the community center that's closing. Facilitating identity and cultural discussions. These are really important, and if you can have some of your alumni or other folks be a part of it, that's also great, because just like what we do is we have older folks who've experienced it talk to younger folks. There's even a divide amongst us. Those conversations are still very important. And then we talk about, this is not as applicable, but incorporating more experiential learning and kinesthetic activities. So not just the lectures. I myself cannot go to many lectures. I would have a hard time if I were sitting in this audience with you. So thank you for the time you're spending listening to me. But doing other types of things, having discussions, using art, things like that. And then the empowering alumni and active students as leaders. So all of these really help build spaces. If you want to talk about reputation, you want to talk about Aberoo, these spaces are really important for addressing some of the challenges our community still has around these. And then the very last slide is just, I listed a bunch of our programs. We have run with volunteers for so many years. We are very much, although we started out as a youth organization, we do a lot of intergenerational work. So our wonderful ambassador who organized this program, we have youth ambassadors here who have gone to Children of Persian, all sorts of events. If you want to be a part of any of this, if you want to even just talk about, you think you're starting something and you'd like to get some advice about what it's like to start in the Iranian community and organizing, we would love to be involved, because a lot of the amazing work happens on the local front. We are a national organization, but most of our programs are very much in touch with local communities. And so I think that's really going to be important with how we move forward as a community. Thank you.
So thank you, Mona Jan. Thank you, Iyab. Thanks to all of you who are here with us today. I would like you to write down your questions for our speakers, because after lunch, you're going to have a panel discussion and you will have a chance to ask your questions then. I am happy to introduce our second speaker here, Dr. Ehsan Habibpour. He is a psychiatrist in dual training in child and adolescence and adult psychiatry. He's a diplomate in psychiatry of American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and Subspecialty Board of Child Psychology. He's currently practicing here in Alexandria, and we are so happy that he's here with us. He's in Roundhouse Square Counseling in Alexandria. Dr. Habibpour grew up in Iran. He went to medical school in Iran, and then he moved to United States, and he followed his passion for understanding our feelings, and he was very much involved with understanding our feelings and behaviors by adulting, by I'm sorry, I'm losing my space here. In understanding our feelings and behavior by attending an adult psychiatry program in Medical College in Virginia, in Richmond. He came back to Virginia because of his love for nature, and his passion was reflected in a book that he co-authored, The Treatment of Depression in Culturally Diverse Children and Adolescents. Dr. Habibpour worked a lot with depression and issues of bicultural families. I'm so glad he's here with us. Dr. Habibpour, welcome. And please forgive me for...
It was an article, not a book. Well, good morning, everyone. Really happy to be here. It's a great gathering. Just wanted to also thank everyone who was organizing this event. I understand that it's been probably a few months of efforts to organize this, and prior to that, years of passion and interest in this area and in this subject. So I really appreciate that, and I hope this opportunities continue. And let me start with introducing two ways of thinking about emotions, emotional problems, emotional disorders. We can think as of emotion, sadness, grief, happiness, as something that is just as a result of, let's say, cause and effect thinking. Something happened, we feel this way, and this is all about us. So that's one way of thinking, cause and effect thinking. I feel sad, something is wrong with me, or something happened around me, so I feel this way, and I need to do something about it. The second way of thinking is that we are all living in a social system, and it's a system way of thinking. That is, our feelings, our thoughts, our even problems form in relation to others. And so we are related to others, and if I feel sad, it's not only about me, it's in relation to something happened in my social system, in my system. And significant relationships are the key part of this. So family of origin, family, and significant others in the relationship are the main players of this system. You might think this is was not a sort of surprising fact, but it's interesting that we tend to think about things more in cause and effect way. Over hundreds of years, we always thought that if something happens, A happens, causes B. So I should either do something about B or do something about A and change things to improve. Versus thinking that necessarily things happen in relation to others, and not only necessarily in one other person, maybe in the system, such as in a family unit. It's easy to say, but it's hard to believe and hard to act on. We are families an emotional unit. Every member of the family is related to each other, and they react to each other's emotional state. And that's becomes a very complex system that we still try to understand it. We haven't found the logic yet to understand this correctly. But what happens a lot in this type of in the families that when something goes wrong, when a member of the family feels sad, when a member of the family relies on alcohol or substances to cope with the situation, everyone would automatically blame that member of the family for whatever is going wrong. Versus if we truly understand and think in this way, in systems way of thinking, we all understand and realize we have a share. And interestingly, that share is 50%. So if there's a family of 5, father, mother, 3 siblings, and the last child of the family has now alcohol dependence, that's nothing. Everyone says this kid is manipulating, he should grow up, he's having this problem. And they don't realize their own role emotionally in contributing to a disorder or emotional state that happens in that member of the family who is challenged and dealing with this difficulty. So how is that important? I think immigration is another trauma, let's say, or stressor for a family. And whatever happens to the family in the steps that immigrates and acculturates to a new society, and how the family adjusts emotionally to this new setting. If we tend to think about it in a cause and effect way, we might miss an opportunity to understand, and we might get into the, again, mistake of blaming a certain member of the family in different ways. And I just wanted to start with that, just wanted to mention that I'm going to talk a little bit about steps of immigration and acculturation from leaving country of origin to arriving to the new country as a first generation, and then a little bit understanding that emotionally, and then understanding the next generation. That helps us to understand next generation. Mana did a really good job kind of pointing this out, an overview and the groundwork of challenges that the next generation deal with. But we need to first understand the family of the origin. You mentioned intergenerations, to be able to understand what's going on with the next generation and what are the challenges, what are their difficulties, how they are trying to cope, and where's the difficulties coming from. Back to the emotional systems way of thinking, if we understand the family, if we understand the relationships, then we can understand the next generation and their challenges and how we can help each other to be able to progress and move forward. So let me talk about first factor is moving and immigration. We tend not to appreciate what a tough experience is immigration and how it can be a destabilizing experience for any person, to the mind of any person who moves from the country of origin to a new country. That there are many factors, of course, depends on what happens to someone when they immigrate emotionally and psychologically, what age they are going through this immigration. Are they they are 5, 6 years old, or they are 20 years old, or they are in mid-age life cycle, or in their 60s, 70s. The second factor is, are they having a choice to choose a country of the origin, or this has happened by force? Is it exile, or is it they made a choice, they chose the country they want to? That's another factor. The other factor about immigration is that what is the preparation of that person? Did they have time to say goodbye to their country of origin, or they had to leave the country on emergency basis because of revolution, because of the war? Did they have the chance to say goodbye to their friends, family members, their country? They knew, for example, 4 months from now they're going to leave the country, or no, they had to leave the country overnight. That affects their experience later on in the process of immigration. A lot of, let's say, us Iranians, we have to deal with the visa issues, war situation, revolution situation. We didn't have the chance to be prepared for that. Other than that, the let's say intrapsychic capacity, our capacity to deal with the separation from our country of origin. We all have different capacities to deal with separation from our own family, separation from our country, and that puts, again, a destabilizing effect on mind, and how we can cope with that and how we can adjust to that is an important factor. So these are all factors, few of the main factors that can affect the experience of immigration. And then the parents arrive to the new country. They have to, first of all, be able to grieve and mourn from their country of origin. And at the same time, they have to deal with all the surprises of the new country that they arrived. That brings a very strong feeling, and that's loneliness. I think no one can experience that other than people who lived in their country of origin and then moved to a new country. This is strong feeling of loneliness that second generations, although they witness that in their parents, but they don't feel that. And this loneliness comes from multiple origins. They lost all the relatives and friends they had, practically. They said goodbye to those. But not only human factor, but non-human factor also. So the language of origin, they missed that. The setting, the country, all little factors that we were used to live in, when it gets changed and we come to the new country, these are all totally new experience. And this new experience might be exciting, but at the same time brings a feeling of loneliness. Factor about how they can assimilate themselves and acculturate to the new setting, a new country. Many times what happens with the parents as they arrive, they need to figure out how they can get a job here, how they can financially be able to support themselves and their kids if they have kids. Many times there's a drop in the social status, that they can't continue the job they had in the country of their origin. So they have to go through certifications, or they have to go through all different other type of experiences to be able to gain a job, to be able to make money, to be able to survive in this country. And that complicates things. So all these things are happening in the course of a very short time. The emotional challenge, the physical challenge, in addition to that, the socioeconomic status challenge. And so many times what happens is that parents, they're in a survival mode. So they forget to care about the emotional needs, because that's the priority. You need to be safe and secure physically to be able to take care of things. And in reaction to that, what happens with the immigrants, they try to find ways to cope with this situation emotionally. One of the main ones is denial. They have different ways of denying the fact that this change has happened in their life, that they said goodbye to the country that they were born. They're in a new country. They're citizens of a new country, and the denial can take different forms. The fantasies of returning. So they hope someday they can go back to their country. Maybe someday the country, economically or politically, going to be different place, and we go back. And it's interesting. The someday phenomena is always there. They tend not to put it too close. They put it somewhere far away. But the fantasy is a way to cope with this emotionally challenging situation. Other than that fantasy return that I mentioned about the denial of, other than the return, they try to replicate the situation here. So with the clothing, with certain type of food, with certain type of gathering, their own social network, they try to make it as if this is like Iran, and deny the fact that they are in a totally different country. That's another form of coping with this emotionally challenging situation, but it might have its own consequences if they don't recognize the feelings and emotions. Finally, there is this fantasy of reparation, that they are trying to repair this with different ways of being creative, with different ways of trying to be productive in the new country, but at the same time, as a reaction, basically, to this strong feeling. Finally, some people, they act as if nothing has happened. This is like Iran. We act like we are in Iran, and it's all cool. And that's another type of defending against this strong feeling. And it can work for some time, but after a while, it's not going to work anymore. So different ways of emotionally dealing with this huge change that is, I would call it more than immigration dislocation. That you get dislocated from your own country of origin to a new country. And how much you have control or not, it makes a difference, but bottom line, you are dislocated. And you are trying to deal with this emotionally challenging situation in different ways. As I mentioned, denial in different forms can be one of it. So anyway, they try to stabilize and settle down in the new country, and now the next generation comes to the picture. And the family going through this now is trying to help the next generation, raise them, help them to grow. At the same, this is by its own is a challenging job. Going through all these experiences and now having a child trying to help them to grow and navigate through the new society that they have minimal idea about is a much more challenging job. And how the members of the family start to interact in this context is a phenomenon of what the next generation will deal with in different forms. What is the personality formation of bicultural youth? What they identify themselves with? There are different environments, they have to identify themselves differently. So at home, the parents, when the child is born, they try to have them to kind of like make them speak the language of origin, because that's one of the ways they kind of still trying to mourn with their own country of origin. They use names that are a reminder of the country of origin. And so the child is now trying to find way to adjust himself or herself, balancing between a home environment that is promoting and inviting people to speak Farsi, to use their middle name that is Persian and Farsi, to learn about the culture, and then they step out of the home, and that's just a door, and then they need to speak English, they need to kind of like getting to know the society. And there was this metaphor of masks that they have to wear on. One mask at home, they're kind of like, they know about Iran, it's cool, they know they can speak some Farsi, my name is this, and then they have to get out and they have another mask. I'm American, I can speak without any accent, I know the culture. So that's one challenge that they have to deal with, and how they emotionally react to this and how parents emotionally react to this based on the parents and the child is going to be different, and it can be challenging at times. Then the other factor is the feelings that are going to play out between members of the family. Sometimes because kids, they get to know the society much faster, the roles get reversed. So they teach the parents about their how to navigate in the society. They teach them about how to work with this modern technology and computers and all that. They have to sometimes correct them language-wise. So that brings on a feeling of guilt in the parents and sometimes shame that they kind of, their role is reversed, and how that plays out. Sometimes kids feel shame of the parents who can't speak fluently English in the society. So they go to grocery store and the parent doesn't know the name of this vegetable, and they have to teach the mom about the name of the vegetable in English. And in interaction with the society, with teachers, with any other occasions, when the parent has accent or can't pronounce things right, the kid feels shameful that my parent cannot operate in this society right. And what are the emotional impacts of that for the kid in this family? And how they interact with each other on a daily basis in this setting. So they basically they're straddling between cultures. two different cultures, actually totally different culture. They straddle in different occasions their name, their fluency in English, all the things that I just mentioned. I mentioned about experiencing shame at having parents different in the new country, feeling taxed by high expectations of their parents. That's one of the other feelings that kids would have, and that is because the parents went through all this hardship to get here. One of the emotional reactions they have is that, see, you are now in a stable country, you should pursue this. Mona mentioned about doctors, lawyers, and all that, and that's a lot of different types of expectations about that. And that can be emotionally burdensome. That they have to meet certain type of expectations of these parents. Sometimes parents tell their kids, we are here because of you guys. And so we expect you guys to do this way or that way. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been here. And that's another example of putting the burden on the kids' shoulders. Having tight restrictions in their autonomy in a new culture. The parents grew up in different cultures, so they put very tight restrictions in romantic relationships, in using substances, and they kind of like want to pursue that very strictly. And that brings up the concept of Aberoo, because of this pressure pursuing academically, or you have to follow these rules, whatever is the origin, could be just or religion-wise, it could be from the kind of national, just the cultural-wise, but brings a gap. At the same time, brings a lot of pressure on the kid and the parents and trying to figure out this. But let me stop here and just go back to where this is coming from. Is it coming from they are just basically calm parents who have certain values and try to enforce them? Or is it coming from parents who had a traumatic experience? I don't know, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, going through immigration, going through loneliness, going through a socioeconomic drop in their status in the new country. These are, and they were going through destabilizing effect of immigration on their mind, but not be able to cope with it right and effectively. So years later, they are anxious parents trying to control their children in different ways. So emotionally, indirectly, we feel more comfortable in this new setting. And understanding these feelings and how they play out in different forms and shapes in parents versus kids is a key factor here, that the more we talk about them, the more we understand them, the more open, free conversations can happen over a dinner table, if needed in consultation room, able to cope more effectively. So they don't interact with each other based on the anxiety or based on the worries or based on certain feelings of shame and guilt. So the kid feels shameful of their parents can speak fluently, so they show certain type of behavior. Parents in response react to that and show certain type of behavior, or bring more body, or and there are plenty of examples that I'm sure you can think of that will happen as a result and as a consequence. So again, understanding how these feelings and emotions play out, it's important. Talking about them are important. There's a good book. There are a number of books talking about acculturation, immigration. There's an author, Salman Akhtar, is a psychoanalyst who has a number of books about this issue, and a lot of examples about acculturation, immigration, and difficulties about that I think it's valuable to learn, to read, and to understand this phenomenon more. Again, the key things for parents are how they can manage these feelings of shame and guilt. dealing with growing kids, how they can be able to understand kids in the new society without putting pressure or restrictions. But at the same time, they have to verbalize their expectations in a non-anxious way. How to do that is easy to say than be done. But again, the more we can understand the feeling experience, emotional experience of each member of the family going through this, and having these occasions to communicate this, the more healthier environment we would have, and I think it would be progressive status. How much time do I have? 5. Okay. So I would just take this last 5 minutes to bring up the subject which is more relevant professionally, and that is the stigma of mental health issues and mental disorder, and that we always, because of some of the cultural background we have in a new society, we have a lot of difficulty with dealing with this issue, and that is that having any kind of problem, as far as, again, anxiety disorder, depressive disorder, that I mentioned is many times part of the dynamics of the family, and there's no one to blame. We have a hard time to seek treatment because of, big time we think that is related to our Aberoo, and unfortunately that postpones treatment, addressing issues, talking about them, and can cause significant consequences. So the more we can have these occasions to be able to have an open dialogue and to be able to discuss these things, the more we can work on decreasing the stigma. And I think it's very important to address these needs and mental health needs in a very open environment and take away that factor. Okay, I guess I'm done. Thank you very much.
I appreciate you staying here with us. As I mentioned earlier, we have a little bit of a change in our agenda. Thank you so much, Dr. Habibpour, because it's very important. We don't usually speak about this stigma, and it is a big part of our challenge, I feel. And please keep your questions, and then we will discuss them after we come back, after we go to lunch and come back. I want to thank all of you again for being here today and being with us. I think we were going to have a video clip, but our video person is gone, probably preparing lunch. Okay. So, someone has to cook. Okay, then. Yes, thank you.
Can we have 5 minutes break?
Yes.
Is that possible to have 5 minutes break?
Of course. Would you like to do that?
Yes, please.
All right, we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll show a video, and then we'll have our next speaker.